Hi, welcome to our first hands-on segment. The purpose of these hands-on segments is for me to give you an opportunity to see the actual AWS web console and for you to watch me exercise different functionality and different technologies in the course. I also want you to be able to follow along with me from your home. So you should also try to log in and replicate many of the steps that I'm following during these hands-on segments so that you gain a little bit of familiarity with the process of working with AWS services. Now, I've logged into the AWS Management Console, and just a couple of different things that I want to point out. You can see in the upper right-hand corner of the console, you can see that I'm logged in. It shows my username. It also shows me which region I'm currently working in, which right now is North Virginia, also known as US East 1. If I select this drop-down, I can change to other regions around the world. It's really, really important to understand what region you're working in at all times. When you're building out services, it can be confusing sometimes when especially if you're working in multiple regions. You go to, let's say, US West 2, launch a bunch of EC2 instances, and then change to the US East 1 or North Virginia region. And if you look at the dashboards, you'll see that you won't be able to see resources that are running in other regions. So that your web console view is specific to the region that you're currently working in. That's why it's really important to pay attention to this region designation here in the upper right corner of the web page. The first thing I want to do is I want to go to the IAM service, and I'm going to do that. I can do that a couple different ways. I can go to this Find Services search and just type in IAM or Identity Access Management and select the IAM service. I can also go to the Services drop-down menu, and I can type in IAM here and select the service, or I can look through this whole listing and select the service directly. And as you can see, there are a lot of different services that are available within the AWS ecosystem. IAM is located under the Security, Identity, and Compliance menu. Typically, if I'm looking for a service, I will just type it in because I know the service name, or I know, it's identity and access management. So I'll just type in identity and then select the service that I want to go to. And then AWS brings up the Identity Access Management dashboard. You'll notice that the region has actually changed. I mentioned earlier that IAM is a global service. You can't select a particular region because any change that you make to IAM resources is applied globally across all regions within your account. There's one other thing I want to note, and that is that AWS is constantly updating and changing these web dashboards. So I recorded this video at some point in 2019, but if you're looking at this video at a later date, it's highly likely that AWS will make some changes to the web console. So just note that as you're following along, if you see small differences in your dashboard versus the ones in this video, it's probably due to the changes that have been made. In fact, I've actually filmed videos like this in the past, and a week or two after I filmed the video, AWS makes a change to the dashboard, which already sort of renders my video sort of obsolete in some ways. So that's just the price you pay when you're working with these web interfaces, because they're constantly evolving and constantly changing. Okay, so identity and access management. Again, this is the service that controls the users and the groups that we set up in our account. It controls federation to our services. It is also used to define access roles and policies within our account. When you log into the dashboard, you'll notice that there's a user sign-in link, and IAM automatically generates this sign-in link for you. This is the link that you go to when you want to log into your account via the web. And you can actually customize this login page. If you click on the customize link, then you can change that link to something that is more appropriate for you or for your organization, something that may be easier to remember. The IAM dashboard also gives you kind of an overview of the security within your account. And your goal is to have the checkboxes next to all of these security sort of compliance rules. It's a great idea to activate multi-factor authentication on your root account. Multi-factor authentication is authentication where you have you require a username and password to access your account, and you also require another device or another access code. And generally that's provided by a PIN code using something like Google Authenticator running on your cell phone. So you would need your username, your password, and a 6-digit PIN code from Google Authenticator that just randomly changes over time. Great idea to activate multi-factor authentication, and AWS strongly encourages you to do that. I've created individual IAM users within my account, so I'm not just using the root account here. I'm actually using an individual user that has administrative-like capabilities within the account. I'm using groups to assign permissions, and I've set up an IAM password policy, which I'll show you how you can do that here in a little bit. Also, I rotate access keys within the account, and I'll describe what that means here shortly as well. So let's start by just creating a new user within our account. I'm going to go to the users link, and I'm going to add a new user to my account. And I'm just going to call it, let's say, my test user account. So I give it a username of test, and then I have to specify what access type this user will have. And there are two types of access you can give a user in AWS. You can give a user access to this web console that we're currently working in. And so they can log into the web console and they can do different things based upon their particular role. You can also allow a user to access AWS resources programmatically through the AWS API. And a user would do that using an access key ID and a secret access key. So if we select that as well, we can then enable programmatic access for this particular user. In terms of the console password, AWS can auto-generate a password for us, or we can provide a custom password. And then we can also require the user to reset their password the very first time that they log in, which I think is always a good idea. So we've defined the username and what access type they have. Next, we need to set up permissions. And this is where we can use those fine-grained access permissions that are made available to us by IAM. We can add the user to an existing group that we have defined within our account. And I've got 2 different groups that are currently set up. We can copy permissions from an existing user, and we can attach access policies directly to this user account. In this case, I'm going to, let's say I'm going to just create a new group. I'm going to create a group and I'm going to call it let's see, I'm going to call it my testers group. And my testers group, I'm going to assign and associate a policy with this group. And let's say we're going to give them Amazon EC2 full access. So I'm going to use this particular policy and create that group. Now I've got a new group called testers, and they have the Amazon EC2 full access policy is associated with that group, and I'm going to add this particular user to that group. Next, I can add some tags to that user. You'll find that you can tag most any resource within AWS. And what do I mean by resource? Well, resources are all the different things that you're setting up, users, and you're setting up EC2 instances and S3 buckets, and so compute resources, access resources, and so on. You can associate tags, and tags are essentially metadata that are associated with a particular resource. And it's metadata in the form of a key value object. Well, what would I use for a key and a value? You could use whatever you want to. Oftentimes we'll use tags for associating resources with a particular team or a particular project for cost allocation purposes. For example, I might have a key called project, and my project is codenamed Fido, for example. So I've just created a new tag with a key of project, value of Fido, associated with my user account. That way, later on, if I wanted to do some sort of analytics work, or I want to do some cost allocation analysis, then I could search for all of my resources that have this particular project tag, and I could group those resources together for analysis purposes. Click on the next button to review. Here are all the settings I'm going to use for my user, my new user test account, and I'm going to create the user. When I create the user, it tells me that the user was successfully created, and I can download this .csv file. That's going to contain my username and the auto generated password that AWS is going to assign to the account. I can then immediately use those credentials to log into my AWS account via the web console. And remember, it's going to be the way I set it up was that it would force me to enter in a new password the first time that I log in to the account. And that's something that you could try on your own. Download that CSV file, open it up, and then try to log in using those credentials. You'll also notice that AWS has set up an access key ID for me with a secret access key. So if I want to programmatically log into this account using the test user credentials, I could do that using the access key ID and the secret access key ID. What do I mean by programmatic access? Well, what I mean is that you might have an application or some script code that you've written for automation purposes, and that code needs to be able to log into your AWS account to perform some tasks. That code can log into your account as this particular user if it has the access key ID and the secret access key. It's really, really important to keep these keys confidential. And you can see it's not even showing the key. I have to click on this link to show the access key, the secret access key, and I have to click on the password link to show the password. So by default, it's not going to display it on this screen. If somebody has your access key ID and your secret access key, effectively they have your account. They have all the credentials they need to access your account from anywhere in the world. And they'll have the full access privileges of your account when they do so. So it's highly, highly important to keep this information confidential. And throughout this course, I'll highlight areas where you could get into trouble by inadvertently exposing these access keys. So the important thing is that you want to store these keys in a very safe place. I'll go ahead and then close this. And you can see I've got another user, the test user, that has been added and enabled in my account. One of the things you might have been thinking about when I created this account, I created a new group called the Testers Group. I'll go ahead and click on that Testers Group now. And you may have noticed that the Testers Group, I associated that with a permission, a policy called the Amazon EC2 Full Access Policy. Well, what is that policy? I mean, what does that mean? If I can show this policy, and when I do that, it will actually show me the policy document. And recall that the policy document describes the things that a particular user or role is allowed to do within AWS. If I click on this policy, then this is what is in a format that we call JSON, which we'll talk about later on in the course. But this JSON document has a series of policy statements. And for example, this policy says that the user or role can use all EC2 services. So they're allowed to use all EC2 services, and they can use EC2 services to modify any resource within the account. That's what this policy statement says. This statement says that the user is allowed to use any of the elastic load balancing services or actions on any resource with the account, and so on. That's what all these different statements are saying. So this policy is allowing a user to access AWS and exercise all of the different EC2 services within AWS. If this user were to log in and try to do other things like create new user accounts or create S3 buckets, the AWS would not allow them to exercise those particular services. Okay, so let's go back to the AWS dashboard here and look at a couple other things. I mentioned that you can create roles within the system, and we'll look at this in more detail later in the course, but you can create roles. A role has one or more policies associated with it. We can apply a role to a service within AWS and give that service access permissions within our account. We can create policies. You probably noticed that by default, there are dozens and dozens of different policies already set up within your account. These are called managed policies. These are curated by AWS. We can create our own custom policies as well to finally tailor access policies within the account. You can set up federated identity providers within your account. I won't go into this in really any detail, but this is something that you would use if you wanted to connect your AWS account to something like your corporate Active Directory system. You can manage various account settings. You can specify a password policy, and a password policy is essentially like the minimum the minimum allowed, password complexity that you require within your account. So for example, in my account, I say that minimum password length should be at least 6, which is probably too short. I'm going to change that. I think today I would do probably at least 10 or 12 as a minimum password length. Longer is always better. And then I can specify the amount of password complexity that's required. So uppercase letters, lowercase numbers. I allow users to change their own passwords and so on. There are a couple of other things I can do here. I can actually enable and disable regions within my account. Now, this can be really helpful, right? Because by default, when you create a new account, all of the regions are available to you. And, but that might not be such a good thing. There might be regions of the world where you just simply don't want to create new infrastructure. And that might be for security or compliance reasons, or even cost reasons. It's relatively inexpensive to deploy infrastructure here in the United States, but it could be much, much more expensive to deploy infrastructure in other regions of the world, like Asia Pacific and so on. So you might not want your team members playing with infrastructure in other regions. You might want to just limit them to like US East 1 and US West 1, and not allow them to create infrastructure in a bunch of other regions. So you can control that here by activating and deactivating different regions. You can create a credential report that you can use for auditing purposes, and that'll list all of the account users and their credentials, and that might be helpful for auditing purposes. If you're dealing with a compliance officer or compliance team, oftentimes they will want these sort of credential reports as they go through their annual auditing. So that's really IAM in a nutshell. It's a core service. It's a global service. IAM impacts all other services within AWS because we use it to control access to those services. And you will be using it periodically within this class as you create new infrastructure and as you're defining the access privileges that are required for one service to communicate with another service.